in the Minerva Humanities Center at Tel Aviv University. Because I'm a visual culture researcher for this session. So Etienne is an assistant professor in the Department of History and Sociology and Science at the University of Pennsylvania. On the history of human-animal relation and on the ways information of a book, Wild Wilderness, to making of modern wildlife. And on his presentation, Dan will comment. School of Environment Institute. Our animal, environmental, individual animal
species
versus species, and population conversations. So, please, Etienne.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Okay, I'd like ample time for discussion, so I'm going to try to keep this brief and only show a few pictures and try to paper. So first say, in general, what I'm trying to understand is shifts in biopolitics, affect, and temporality in the field of wildlife conservation by thinking through the phenomenon of the wildlife live cam or wildlife webcam, which is something that's been around in some form since the late 90s, but has really boomed in recent years. And this is part of a bigger project trying to think through the ways that digital media are being used. These portable mobile telephones that can record and transmit. The way that these digital media are being used in the non-human world with non-human life in new ways, and particularly the ways that those technologies are being used to change interactions that we've traditionally thought of as being about nature conservation or recreation. So things like wildlife conservation. I want to make a couple of methodological notes. First, even though there's a heavy emphasis here, I'm not trying to assign as deterministic, but so I don't want to make an argument that because there are live cams, therefore we must think about affordances and materialities of these media seriously. And that's, I do think that there is something distinctive about the way that these technologies allow for connections as easy. And the second note on method is that I'm also trying not to tell a story about popularization, and this is actually something which I feel guilty of doing in earlier work, which is really starting the story from the scientist's perspective, position, looking at how scientists kind of developed or experimented with new ways of relating to their animals, and then trying to see how those new ways of mother, father, not sure which one, peregrine falcon, and these are two of the chicks. This is a kind of like shelter that was intentionally built for these peregrine falcons, which were placed out, I think 16 years ago now. The first pair was placed out here on this ledge, a captive bred pair. I don't know, did I step on something?
It's a cycle. We had to finish. Begin without one.
This is about the temporality of the image.
Do you see it? Do you have it?
Nope.
It went off also on your end.
The computer is up?
Well, this is.
Aha. Wait, here we have some things back.
Okay. Oh, it just went. Maybe just went to sleep.
And now it's stuck.
There we go. Okay. So they were introduced about 16 years ago.
Hmm.
Okay.
Okay. Fine. Works fine.
We're good? Okay. I don't have no idea how to say this, but this is the bird, according to Wikipedia.
But it's not dead.
Okay, great. It's a peregrine falcon. It's one of the most widely distributed birds in the world, so it can be found on every continent except for Antarctica. It's a very, very successful predator. It had a kind of population crash in North America, at least in the 60s and 70s, due to DDT, this pesticide, which led to eggshell thinning, so the eggshells would be crushed in the nest. And by around 1970, it was basically extinct east of the Mississippi River, so most of eastern North America, you couldn't find this bird at all, and there was probably a total number of a few hundred birds in North America. Now the numbers are back up into the thousands. It's considered a great success and was actually listed on the U.S. endangered species list in the 1970s and then taken off again, I think, at the end of the 90s. The webcam, just geographically situate, the webcam I'm talking about is here in Harrisburg, where the red arrow is. I've never been there. It's also part of the story. And this is the Rachel Carson, beautifully named Rachel Carson State Office Building. Of course, Rachel Carson was the one who raised alarm about the potential effect of pesticides on bird life and also on human life. This houses the Department of Environmental Protection for the state of Pennsylvania. And you can see this is and it's not a huge town, Harrisburg, but this is a pretty urban area. And you'll see in a moment what that looks like from the perspective of the bird's nest. What can you see? Well, you can see there's a it's a 3-camera setup. It runs 24 hours a day. You can watch the birds coming and going. You can watch the birds hatching. You can watch the parent birds bring prey up to the ledge to feed to the baby birds. It only runs during the season, like the nesting season, because after that there's not that much to see. The birds that are there, the chicks, get banded. They get captured and banded, and I read about this in the paper. This is actually the banding session. Those birds are dead, dead and stuffed. But some live birds came a few minutes later. This is the secretary of the Department of Environmental Protection for Pennsylvania saying, "What these falcons can teach us today is important. We're all part of the web of life." This is also a very children-oriented message. You can see from what I'm showing you now, they have tweets. They have a Twitter account that they try to use for public relations purposes. I hear some laughter. I also found this. It's hard not to anthropomorphize, right? To think like that. To try to think about what that bird is thinking. But you can see here that the bird has been banded on both legs. Permanent kind of federal government tag, and then a colored tag that's actually readable from a distance if you have good enough binoculars. So this individual animal will be identifiable even after she grows her flight feathers and makes her own way in the world. And that's actually true of, I think, virtually all of the 43 nests or so that are in Pennsylvania that the birds have been banded and are monitored in some way. So they also, through the Twitter account, you can follow kind of important events in the life of these animals. So, for instance, this was around June 3rd. There's a tweet this morning, white banded female took first flight. She's okay and resting on a ledge on the Capitol building. So this is one of the chicks flying for the first time. Less pleasant things happen, so the birds will sometimes need to be rescued because they end up sitting in the middle of the road, right, at risk of being run over or have other problems. This was another bird, one of the birds that was spending time on the road. You can see there's just a few pictures here. The bird was captured with a box, brought back up, checked for her health. And I'm emphasizing this sort of hands-on work because I think this is really essential to understanding what kind of relationship is being established. This is a very hands-on relationship. All of the birds that are now living in Pennsylvania were released from captive populations initially, or are descendants of birds released from captive populations, and they continue to be intensively managed and cared for in this way. I have the sad duty of reporting that one of the 3 chicks that was born this spring died within a couple of days of fledging, so within a couple of days of growing her flight feathers because she flew into a window. So it's a dangerous environment for falcon chicks. There is this, I mentioned communities, online communities that grow up around these kinds of live cams. This is actually much more active than the Twitter feed. I think the Department of Environmental Protection had possibly great hopes that the Twitter feed would turn into a very vibrant community that would help it get its message out. That hasn't really happened, and instead there's a very small but devoted community, I would say of maybe 10 people who post to this site. Rini, the one who you can see here, I believe it works for the Department of Environmental Protection. So she's the main contact, and then the rest are volunteers. And they are called fledge watchers, a lot of them. They actually go during the fledging period and watch the birds carefully, and when they get into trouble, report that to the staff, the official staff, who can come and rescue them. This is a description of one of those rescues. There's also something that happens, which you might call, I don't know what to call it. Maybe there's probably somebody who's come up with an official name for this, but this is like screenshot photography or remote photography. So there are a lot of bird watchers, who like to spend time taking photographs of birds with their own photographic equipment. There are also bird watchers or bird lovers who like taking photographs of like screenshots of webcams and then posting them with commentary. And in a way, it's sort of like saying, look, I'm devoted, I was watching, I was perceptive, and I cared enough to take this photograph of what can often be extraordinarily boring, long stretches of no activity. I saw something special happening, and I captured it, and I'm going to share it with the rest of the community and kind of frame it with some narrative that helps us kind of collectively tell a story about what's happening to these birds. So this is what food delivery looked like just now. I thought the parent was going to lose their foot. I'm not sure what that means, lose their foot or lose their footing or something. But this is a moment of two of the birds being fed. This is also a place where enthusiasts can express their kind of powerful affective engagement with the birds, both positive and negative emotions. So this is somebody posting a picture with expressing anxiety and fear on behalf of the birds. And the reason why is that this is either one of the chicks, one of the young of this year, or the parent. I think it's probably one of the young. That's another one of the young over here who hasn't flown yet. And so the watcher is very worried that the bird's just going to fall off and not know how to fly, right, because of that precarious perch. Makes me nervous to see them there when they haven't fledged yet. This is another expression of emotion. This is from that kind of official coordinator, Rini, who's thrilled that one of the birds that was in trouble is now back on the ledge, and then another member of the community saying that they're really happy for Rini, that Rini is happy. So everybody's happy. Okay. Let me see if this is going to work. Okay, here we are. We're in Harrisburg.
This is live?
This is live. So I'm just going to distractingly leave this up. And I am already at like 15 minutes, aren't I? Yeah, damn. Okay. I will very, very quickly say some 3 key points that I tried to draw out of thinking about live cams. The first is I've been thinking about something which I know Dan is interested in, this relationship between the way we care about individuals and the way we care about species. And I think in a lot of the rhetoric about these kinds of live cams, there's been a certain kind of dismissal of the kinds of care that these volunteers, the people who post to these kinds of websites, express. A dismissal of that care as being focused only on individuals, right? And kind of missing out on the bigger picture. And that is a pretty common way for people who are approaching things from an ecosystem or a species or an environmental perspective to approach people who care about individual animals, is to say, well, this is a kind of bourgeois or Disneyfied a sentimental affection for the animal. I feel like that is often correct, but in this paper I wanted to try to do an experiment of thinking generously and positively towards these practices and trying to see if in them there is the seeds of something that could become a more productive kind of environmental engagement. And what I've seen happening here, at least in the peregrine falcon case, is that the species has in some ways receded into the background. On one way it hasn't. In one way the species is still very important. This is an endangered species still in Pennsylvania, and that's why so much effort and attention is given to it. On the other hand, the species is embodied in the 43 nests with chicks and in the relationships that people establish with these individual animals. And so what I tried to suggest in the paper is that these animals are no longer exactly serving the role of like symbols of or representatives of a broader, more kind of ideal type of the species. They're being cared for as individuals that embody the species. Maybe we can talk more about that in the Q&A. I also wanted to make a point about territory and population. when I think about 20th century wildlife conservation and endangered species protection, it's often in terms, I think oftentimes those arguments have been phrased, still are phrased in terms of protecting or preserving or managing populations within given political territories. And by political territory, I mean to include things like national parks, as well as nation states. And to kind of manage populations within those territorial containers. What I think you're starting to see, at least in some pockets and corners of the conservation domain, are ways of managing wildlife that are focused on individuals in particular situations, individuals in particular ecological niches, rather than in territories. And those ecological niches can be topologically discontinuous. They can be dependent on seasons, on cultures, on human-built infrastructure. And it doesn't quite make sense, I think, for some of these projects to think in terms of territories and populations. And then the last thing that I'll say before turning things over to Dan is that I think I want to try to make a connection to the discussion we had in a previous session about how we care and what we care for, whether we're caring for species or for ecosystems or for environments. And one of the things that I see when I look at this case is, well, one of the ways to interpret this kind of case is as a narrowing of affective concern to a specific object in a way that from the outside can really look like a kind of blind spot, right? A blind spot to the bigger picture, a failure to take into account systemic effects. But I actually don't really believe that anybody takes into account systemic effects. I don't really believe that anybody cares for everything, right? Everybody cares for something, and you have to choose. And so I think these people have chosen to care for these particular animals, and I think there's something very promising in that. There's something very promising in their willingness to sacrifice, to not think about the representation of these animals as being representatives of something, and instead to think about their immanent reality. There's also dangers. There's a reason why there are lots of webcams for peregrine falcons and not so many webcams for the flower-loving fly that we had in the previous presentation. So there's dangers of focusing too narrowly in some ways. But yeah, I didn't want to go this long, so I'll stop now, and maybe if anything I have said is incredibly unclear, we can clarify in the Q&A. Mm-hmm. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay. So first of all, I'd like to thank Chagai and Shai and Etienne for raising the subject that I must admit I knew of webcams, and I even watched a few, but I never thought of what the implications could be or may be. I'm a little more pessimistic than you about changing worldviews, but I've rearranged my comments to try and connect them to different papers that we heard before. So let's see. First of all, the lists. Getting on one of these cams puts you in perspective, makes you visible, and as you said, peregrine falcons are a good case. Other birds, especially bird nests, are very easy to put a camera on, especially those who come back to the same spot. It's much harder to do with other animals. You don't see many. Just the last talk we talked about some more charismatic species. So again, as you mentioned, you don't see any flies or even butterflies that are probably much more. Another thing that I've seen is that many of these cameras are placed in zoos. So you see a lot of the animals out of context. You see the penguins, for example. You see a lot of them in zoos. They're cute, they're funny. There's lots of action there usually. So they're very watchable, but in terms of understanding something about penguin life, I'm not sure how these cameras actually service the species in any way. And that's another thing which is probably more of a personal agenda than connected to this meeting. We have a completely different set of questions when it comes to animals than we do with humans. There's an industry that uses live cams, and feminists all over the world have discussed what that means. They talked about rights and ownership and other things that we never think about in animals. And while that may seem completely unconnected, I think that if we think about the Europeans collecting artifacts and blood from people 50 years ago, from savages 50 years ago, they never thought that those would become indigenous people who would actually have a claim about them. So maybe we should think about the way we look at animals, and even if our actions remain the same, we should at least be able to explain why we think differently about animals than we do about humans. Another thing that talk about bird watchers in Taiwan, other than being birds, there's also the issue of professionals versus amateur enthusiasts, and you can see it again here. There are those who are allowed to and would actually go down the street and catch the bird and bring it back when it falls or flies or whatever, and there are those who watch it anxiously and care about the individual much more than the species. Another thing is that we have about the dates. I think you mentioned that we have this fixed image of a certain time where something looked at a certain way. And when you talk about peregrine falcons, for example, human settlements, agriculture brought with it a lot of food for them. So when we say that they are disappearing, they may actually be going back to what their population was before agriculture brought a lot of food for them. So again, we're trying to think of what we would like to see, and we always think of falcons and other animals as positive versus mice, rats, and other rodents as negative. And it's not necessarily biologically correct or historically correct. So that's again something okay, so my last, I'm not sure if it's a remark or a comment or just not sharing your optimism. I think the case of the delta smelt and other animals show that we are not moving away from species conservation in a certain area. We are reintroducing wolves to Yellowstone, so it's species specific to a certain area rather than freewheeling, which is kind of what I would like to see more of, and perhaps you too, but I don't see that happening in the scientific context. I think it's very hard to convince the conservationist societies of the importance of individuals rather than species compositions, populations, or other wholes that they usually look after.
Mm-hmm.
So
Etienne, do you want to comment?
Yeah, so thank you for that comment, and thank you for making those links to the other presentations, which I think is really useful. I intentionally focused on one that wasn't in a zoo because I find the ones in zoos like grotesque or something. Like but I find kind of zoos grotesque. So I just see the wildlife, the wild cam as an extension of the problem with zoos in the first place. And so that's one of the reasons why I chose this particular case, because I think you could actually learn quite a bit about what it is to be a falcon in Pennsylvania these days from this, in context, because this is the context of a falcon in Pennsylvania today, right? It's skyscrapers and bridges. But I agree that the zoos are not useful. I feel like there's only kind of one other thing I want to address right now, which is this kind of general question of how promising this is and how pessimistic one should be. I have spent a lot of time thinking about kind of very hands-on wildlife research techniques that involve doing things like tranquilizing animals and mutilating them for marking purposes and putting tags and collars on them, and the kinds of things that were done with the experimental wolf population that was introduced to Yellowstone and with a lot of other animals, and have had a lot of, you can't use the same language of kind of like rights and autonomy that you can use for humans, I don't think, because I don't think that animals are participating in our kind of political society in the same way as people are, and because oftentimes animals are not aware, I'll say often, very often animals are not aware that the collar that they're wearing is transmitting their information, like their location, to another source. So it makes it different from a person who knows that he or she is being videotaped or being exploited, or in a particular way. Yeah. So, but I think Dan was raising a very particular case where people are aware of. Maybe not. Maybe more generally. Yes. Yeah, and so then on the other hand, there are similarities, and those similarities involve like making humans seem a little less special. So when I first got interested in this project, which is in the general subject of wildlife surveillance and tracking, it still wasn't entirely the case that everybody on the planet was carrying a tracking device with them, but that's changed. Now we all carry tracking devices with us all the time, right? Voluntarily. And we don't entirely know what kind of data is being collected and how the data is being used to kind of reshape our political lives and other parts of our lives. So in that sense, like, we're with the animals now. And then, but I don't actually feel too bad about watching these animals. Like, I don't really feel like I'm invading their privacy, because I don't think privacy is the right rhetoric, like the right discourse to understand what's happening here. And then the point that you made about conservationists continuing to think in terms of species, I think is totally right. I do think that there are people who are starting to build kind of vibrant and committed micro communities around these sorts of media technologies, and that might turn into something. But who knows? That's the future.
Yes.
So I was on a plane a couple of weeks ago and flipping through the channels, and I got to a kind of traditional 20th century nature documentary, and the pompous British narrator, and it was actually some birds, fledglings on a cliff, and there was a lot of suspense about whether they were going to know how to fly when they took off. So I was thinking about that as I watched this, and I wanted to hear you reflect about this as a genre in comparison to the 20th century, a genre of nature appreciation film, in comparison to the kind of classic nature documentary in which the filmmaker constructs a plot line that in which the animals, one critical part of it is that humans actually can't intervene and are hidden, and that you have insight into the lives of animals as they lead it by themselves. And then a narrative is typically constructed that looks something like, that may well look something like human life, warfare, entering into a community, family, how families raise their children, this kind of thing. And this is just, it's an interesting, very different kind of genre where, humans are very present, and the viewer may even be able to take some responsibility and intervene in the lives of the objects that are being watched. And there's also a sort of ambiguity about whether a plotline is going to be able to be constructed or not. And you were showing us nice examples about trying to follow the family lives, but maybe it just won't work. That they'll disappear, or like the plotline may or may not happen. So I just wanted to hear your thoughts on how nature appreciation may differ as this genre takes over from a more that other kind of genre of nature documentary from the 20th century.
Yeah, I think there's a really interesting development that happens in late 20th century nature documentaries where the behind the scenes or the making of starts to become almost as important as the thing itself. So if you've watched some of like the David Attenborough BBC specials,
That's when this one's bad. I didn't see that part.
like sometimes there is the normal one which might have David Attenborough petting a sloth or whatever, but it's mostly the pristine nature thing. But then there's oftentimes also, and I think it was increasingly in the last couple of decades of the 20th century, the kind of the making of or the behind the scenes, where you actually get to see the cameraman, sitting there behind the blind for 3 months. You don't have to watch him for 3 months, but and I think that was like answering some kind of desire that was moving past that mid 20th century nature documentary to try to, but it's still splitting the two into two different segments. One is pure nature, and the other is the fascination with technique and the production. And then with these things, everything is kind of mixed together in some ways. There's still a behind the scenes. There's still things that don't show up on camera, like in the banding that I talk about in the paper. There's a moment where the birds actually have to be taken from the banding area in the building back onto the ledge and released, and you never see that. You're in the room watching everybody file out, and then it flips back to the ledge, and there are the birds, primping themselves. And so there is something that's being cut out, right? Like that's still behind the scenes. On the other hand, like you do get to see a lot, and you get to see things that don't necessarily match the narrative that even the Department of Environmental Protection would necessarily want to convey. There's a case somewhere in Pennsylvania right now, I forget where, or recently, where like one of the bands around the bird's legs was actually too tight, and so the bird's legs started to swell. And so that's a case in which the intervention that was supposed to be for the sake of the birds actually starts harming the birds, and then there was a whole debate about whether or not it would be even more harmful to capture the bird again to remove the band than it would be to just let the bird hopefully try to survive the banding. And that's the kind of narrative that you would never see I think in a traditional film. And one of the things I would love to look more at as I continue this project is precisely this work of narrative building, because I do think sometimes it fails, either for technical reasons like the camera breaks, or there's a case in New York where the birds were getting disturbed by activity within the office from which they were being filmed. So when people came in and out of the office, it would scare the birds off the ledge, and this was leading to problems. So they installed a kind of coating on the screen, but then that prevented the camera from getting a good view, and so that kind of cut short. That was like the end of the season, right? Like somebody gets, one of the actors gets sent to jail for, whatever. Season's over. Right, and so that narrative gets cut off, right? And so I think actually it would be really interesting to look in more detail at these cameras and see how people struggle to construct narratives around scenes that don't necessarily automatically build them. There's more to say, but leave it there for now.
I'll collect a few comments and questions.
So you flip things for me a little bit, right? And here you explain the context. I didn't quite get it from the paper, I have to say, because it just seemed like counterintuitive when you can't, So I think it's important to present that narrative at the outset, that you are actually trying to create an alternative way of thinking, rather that kind of builds on, but moves away from the individual versus species kind of bifurcation that so controls this discourse, right? While still acknowledging that there are other ways of saying it that are not individual versus species, that their population, focuses, and that they're not necessarily, or different ways, right? So these are not the only two ways. Okay, so that's kind of a more editorial kind of comment, but I was also. I guess there were two moments where it seemed counterintuitive to me. I guess because
by counterintuitive, do you mean wrong?
No.
Okay.
No, I don't know
Okay.
if I'd say that. Actually, productive in a way. It's just different than how I than how I see it, but challenging, I guess. Sorry, this is my jet lag brain. Okay. So let me try and remember, because I read it on the airplane. So I'm going to try to kind of recover this where I kind of. So you're actually claiming that we're moving from biopolitics basically back to surveillance. Like in Foucauldian terms, you're kind of moving back, right? I mean, basically back to the panopticon, or actually oligopticon, right? Because it's not the few looking at the many; it's the many looking at the few, right? And so in a way, like at least Foucault's genealogy doesn't fit in. I mean, this is what I meant counterintuitive. Just based on this kind of Foucauldian discourse, it just flipped it. And this is kind of this is a transformative moment, right? We're going back to cameras. I mean, so that was kind of one thing that was challenging for me, and the other one, I guess, is this kind of endorsement of the implicit, you don't say that, of the animal rights discourse as this kind of relational, has to do with contextual, has to do, and taking away that the ideological element there that actually abstracts, the animal. Okay, I'll explain it with an example. The California condor, okay? So there was I think it's perfect for this, and it would be interesting to look at these two birds because they have a very intense relationship, right? California condor, in the 1980s, 22 birds left. There was a debate whether to move those 22 birds into captivity, and the Ottoman Society was against it and sued the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Did I tell you that? Yeah.
No, I'm
Yeah.
familiar with the case. Yeah.
So anyway, but then the Ottoman Society people, the narrative was better dead than bred. The animal rights people said you can't have an animal in captivity because then it's out of context, right? So kind of going back to Dampierre. And then, and then your comment about the zoo being grotesque. I mean, why is that not a zoo? Or how does this really differ? Except for maybe, you made it seem almost like there was some, okay, so this touches kind of core issue for me. How is this not a mega zoo? They're not only just banded, they're not only just, managed, they are hybridized. Actually, how were they delisted? Do you know that they were hybridized? They were there was a whole kind of, and then they were counted. I mean, and I'm not saying that's good or bad, I'm just saying it would be interesting to look into why you make that dualistic way of thinking, zoo bad. Now it's outside, I don't know, on this building, this is in situ, this is good, this is wild. So anyway, I guess
thank you.
Take it away.
Yeah, another, okay?
Yeah.
We'll collect some,
Yeah, I was interested by the idea of sacrifice, and the idea of a package of traits, which is actually the way you frame the opposition between species and individual, which might seem too abstract, but it's actually a kind of reasoning on how to represent collectivity. But actually the way you think about sacrifice in your work on wildlife tracking is this question, this ethical question of how much harm could we do to some individual to preserve the species by the weight of the track. And I was wondering if we could make a power. So I see how this kind of life cam that is more respectful interests you to get out of this problemality. But I was wondering if we could make a parallel with other fields of conservation, where the term intrusion or non-intrusion becomes in play, as in the field of museums. There are some modes of restoration that are considered non-invasive that use also a lot of scan imaging to know exactly where to intervene, instead of having all this question of conservation. How much can you intervene in the object without destroying it? How many objects can you destroy if you want to salvage the collection? And I think it's also kind of ethical questions of therapeutic overwork in some way, or that is. So actually, the question is on the role of intrusion and non-intrusion in these practices of conservation.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
So my question is inspired by the fact that I've been staring at this very empty space.
Yeah.
As I was thinking about it, basically what we see is very still and empty location, and so the whole idea of this camera, I mean, we have 3 different angles, but it's still this one point of view, and in a way dramatically different from what tracking is about. From my understanding, it's not about looking at the movement in space of these animals who are into tidal, again, to repeat that, to know no borders and all that. But so I wonder if these, I'm just curious about this whole culture of use of cameras, if there's been ways of following kind of more banding or ringing and put cameras on animals and doing that type of, like a GoPro type of thing. And people would watch that and see what I think that would kind of fulfill a whole lot of other fantasies people have. And so I guess just to know if there's something like that, and also if not, what do you think how this use of a camera would affect the relationship of people to this animal, to an ecosystem, to the environment, or not?
Okay. Thank you for the questions. I feel like there's actually resonance between Iris and Frédéric's questions. Actually, let me just start by saying about the question of biopolitics. I think it was Andy who said that, or maybe this was just in a conversation, that the nice thing about Foucault and biopolitics is that he never wrote like the definitive tome, where we can all go look and see exactly what biopolitics really is, which is part of the reason that it's a productive term. There is a particular, I do think that this particular configuration of understanding of populations within territories is something that I see over and over again. And even when those territories are embedded in other territories, or even when those territories are understood as pathways or flyways, the idea of managing populations within like pre-given territorial territories is something that seems very powerful to me, or very dominant in a lot of conservation, especially like biodiversity conservation rhetoric. And there's something about that seems like very limiting to me, and that it seems like there's a lot of practices that actually try to get away from that, and that produce these sort of discontinuous territories, or territories that are dynamic, flexible, multi-layered, and so forth, in ways that demand a different kind of management. And in fact, if you look at the way wildlife managers will talk sometimes about tracking technologies, including things that actually track the animals continuously, that they talk about how it allows you to do much more fine-grained manipulation or management of those populations, so that you can create kind of dynamic protection zones that follow the animals around, more or less. And so to me, like, part of what I was looking at live cams, part of what I was trying to do was try to look at the kind of popular media equivalent in some ways of that. And maybe it was an experiment which may or may not have succeeded. I guess I can jump over to your question, Tamar, for a second. There are people who've put cameras on animals. The National Geographic actually put some money into developing something called the Critter Cam, even in pre-digital days, which was initially mostly targeted towards marine mammals because they're so big that you can put a gigantic camera and like video recorder on them. But now the cameras have gotten so small that I just watched like a eagle flight cam where you can fly along with, it's a little backpack on the eagle, and you can fly along with the eagle as it circles the skyscrapers of Dubai, that sort of thing. Live transmission over the internet of animals on the move hasn't happened yet, and I think that would actually be a pretty remarkable development when it did, because the animals get all over the place into situations that might reveal all sorts of things. You'd also have privacy issues emerging in that context. It would be really interesting to see what happens, but it's not happening yet as far as I know.
It is, if I
is
may,
it? Yeah.
One one place where it is used is military. Those dolphin and other cams were used.
Where?
The military, they used it. You use them to find
Right,
mines
right.
and stuff like that.
Like on dogs or?
And now they use it on dogs as well because they're smaller now. They use them on dogs to look at places where they
Right.
think they may be some danger to humans. So they'd
That's right,
rather
yeah.
see a dog go boom than.
Yeah, and there also I know there are some hunters who will put tags on their dogs that where they can actually say things to the dog through the
Right.
tag and interact with them remotely. So this is potentially creating fields for interaction through these kinds of technologies that could potentially have interesting effects. I just want to say one thing about this question, like my antipathy to the zoo.
So I had to raise that question, right? It was like my role.
Yeah. So, I mean, for me, part of the issue is like, what role does the zoo play when the world is already a zoo? Or when the world is not a zoo and the zoo is no longer a zoo because the zoos are all doing in situ conservation, so they're like also getting outside of their shells, but then the whole rest of the world in which they're doing that conservation is already a lot more zoo-like than it used to be, and because these animals are all being managed. So in some ways, I would say, rather than saying like, I would say like those borders have blurred a lot. I think the display function of the zoo that requires keeping animals in captivity, including keeping animals in captivity that suffer often, or that live lives that are very, very different and very, very restricted compared to the lives that they could live, or that other animals of their kind could live elsewhere. I really don't see the point. I'm like super not convinced by the arguments for conservation, Yeah, I in a way, like, I think the thing that to me that links the question about the museum and the zoo is that in some ways we now live in a world where the world itself is a museum and a zoo, right? Like, we have institutions that are specifically focused on that, but we also have national parks, and we also have like downtown office buildings that are essentially playing the same role that zoos and museums have played in the past. And so when we think about going into nature and either capturing an animal for a collection, right, or managing it in some way, it's not that different in some ways than going into a museum collection and taking a sample out of a drawer. And I'm exaggerating a little bit for effect, but I really think that we're increasingly, in this world of ubiquitous surveillance and increasingly invasive and ubiquitous surveillance techniques, the lines between zoo, museum, and world are getting more permeable. Are blurring more. And so some of the ethical questions that we might confront in terms of maintaining a museum or zoo collection, we're now confronting, period, in the world as such. Yeah.
Well, the office building, how did that fit? I didn't quite get it.
Because you don't need to look at a national park or a game preserve or whatever to find those kinds of
Like the
practices of
malls
management. Like, the office building, this office building.
Oh, okay.
Right?
Sorry.
Like, or your backyard, or, right, like your backyard might have an animal in it that has a tag, or even a GPS tag, right? And so, like, we live in a landscape permeated now where it's possible to use those same kind of technologies of inventory management or conservation of artifacts in the world itself.
So just a follow-up on this. So I'm interested in the specific construction of individuation and of affect that goes along with it. And so when you say we don't have to look at the birds, we no longer have to look at the birds in nature, we can now observe them on the
This
building.
is nature.
Well, wait. Well, no. But I don't think that it would work the same. That is, if the cameras were pointing to what used to be called nature, let me just call it nature for now, to the wild nature, then I think the affect and the individuation would be different than the affect individuation that is created when it's within our reach. So this, although you're sitting in the next city and you're not there, but there is a sense that this creates, which is, I don't need to go anywhere. It's right here, and it's a kind of domestication of these birds, which gives them an individuation, which is on the same. It's not the same, but it's on the same axis as our pet when it's in the house, and Knut when it's in the German the bear, the polar bear in Berlin Zoo. It's not the same, so it would be interesting also to say what exactly the difference is. But it does bring it somehow into our homes, especially given the webcam, and so that creates a certain kind of individuation which nature wouldn't allow, and also a kind of effect that builds on other familiar ways of individuating the animal. So, okay.
Yeah.
This is
Yeah.
Protection is a less relevant discourse because we don't protect domesticated animals. We don't use that narrative, right?
So this would be.
Yeah.
So this would be the following point. I'm not sure that this is in tension with what Etienne says, because if we care about these birds the way we care about our dogs, that's also not exactly the same, but if it's on the same line, that's also fine. I mean, why do we need to do preservation? I mean, this is a relationship.
I think one theme that connects this to previous work that I've done is that it's about the technical conditions for individuating animals, right?
That's the work you've done.
I mean, so I've looked at the history of bird banding, I've looked at the history of radio tagging, I've looked at the history of using photographic databases to distinguish between killer whales, and now looking at these cases in which it's the loyalty to a fixed site that allows you to individuate the animal to a certain extent. And so in a way, I think I would say what I'm trying to understand is an emerging set of technical possibilities for individuating animals that then provide opportunities for people to individuate them for all sorts of purposes. And that includes both from scientific purposes and inventory management purposes, and the kind of affective investments that we see with domesticated animals too. And then the question is, how does that change our understanding of discourses of loss and preservation in this domain when it becomes possible to individuate and narrate these animals, even those that live deep in the wild nature wilderness?
Well, we used to want to protect them because they're other, and here they are being humanized. I'm just kind of following this. This exoticizing doesn't quite exist here, right? They're right here in our homes. So I mean, there is. So I think that it's an interesting point.
But I think domestication is a partly right and partly not right for what's happening here, because so much effort is given to maintaining a kind of wildness, to maintaining certain genetic diversity, to training the animals to continue to behave wild, right? There are all sorts of efforts that are made to keep them from completely assimilating to that domestic category, because if they did, then they would lose a lot of their value. And so there's this tension between that individuation and the desire to keep enough of that sense of otherness that we value them.
And isn't that true for zoos as well? Don't they try to keep them wild in some way? I mean,
you can say.
I guess. I mean, I guess I'm thinking about Knut, who was really far from. Knut was like raised in the arms of his loving papa.
You won't have a habitat to live in very soon, Knut.
Yeah, I don't know.
Okay, so thank you.
Thank you.